and I think it's maybe not for
Sorry.
everybody, but for the most part, February is usually a little more quiet.
And it's also flu season. So I was just reading a text from my athlete saying, I know he was unwell 2 days ago and yesterday, and he was just texting me that he's coming back to the land of the living, which is a good thing.
Okay.
But I think I will ask him to slow down or take it easy a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a pretty, as you may remember, it's a bit of a testing 4 weeks for him. So it wasn't perfect timing, which we didn't know 3 weeks ago, but I think we'll throttle back a little bit for a couple of days.
Okay. Yeah. Let him get his feet on the ground. Yeah. Okay. Anybody?
I had an elite athlete who he was consistently checking in once a week. He wasn't working out at all, was consistently checking in with him, sort of like, hey, how are you feeling? Like, gotta say, I was feeling a little guilty. It's like, I'm building these plans, you're paying the money, I'm checking in with you. And, but he would generally text me and be like, I was sick or I was traveling. And so he wasn't like off the radar. And, and I was like, I need, I'm not seeing workout and I'm feeling, I want to know how you're feeling about this. He's like, it's not, he basically said, it's not you, it's me. I feel really good about the level of attention I'm getting. I haven't been taking advantage of it. And then just when I was starting to think, at some point his wife's going to turn around, and I know them. And I was like, at some point she's going to turn around and be like, okay, experiment over, buddy. You're not doing it, to him, not to me. And then he signed up for a trip to Europe for a cycling vacation, and now he totally is committed. So, I was just doing all the Cliff things, the things that you had said to do, when you see someone going off reservation a little bit. So I feel better about that. And, I had another athlete who is doing Oceanside, but isn't thinking beyond that right now because, going to get that done and then wants to do some life soul searching about what she wants to do with her job.
Okay.
So, she was more consistent than I've ever seen her, and I've known her for 10 years. So I was feeling great about that. And then she got sick. But now she's back on the wagon mostly. So that is good. So,
all typical, all very typical, right? For this time of year. Yeah.
Yeah. All of my three newer athletes are, still having technical difficulties sometimes, but they're slowly getting there. They're slowly chipping away at those things.
Yeah.
But in general are pretty consistent and happy and talking and supporting each other, which is great. And I feel like slowly plugging away.
Great.
Liz got a bike fit. Oh my god, this is like such big news. My one athlete was really unhappy, couldn't do a bike over 30 minutes because she just was like, and she's like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, and I was like, you need a real bike fit. And she's like, I had one at this bike shop, and it was like, no, you need a real bike fit. And so I talked to the fitter, and she talked to the fitter, and she finally got fit on Friday. And it's not perfect. I think she's getting new cranks. But she was like, that's a revelation.
That's good.
And
these are things that you gotta line your athletes up to get done, well in advance, and make sure that they're ready for the season ahead. Some things take, months to prepare for. Some things can be done relatively instantly. But a bike fit it's rare I get people to do bike fits in February. So that's definitely another good sign, good thing. Kyle, how's things with you, your athletes, and Suzanne as well?
Things are okay on my end. Not too much going on for me. So I think March I'm going to dive back into it and see where we're standing, since April and May are going to be the big push anyway.
Yeah.
But I know one of them's been putting in the work and the other one's finally getting into a routine. So I'm just kind of letting them put their head down and work at this point.
All right. That's good. Suzanne? questions, thoughts, anything? You're starting your new athlete soon. Did you guys get to connect?
No, I did not connect with her. I figured I wanted to connect with you first.
Okay.
And then Lindsay, I did send her an email, so just we should connect on her as well.
Okay. All right. We can chat later if you want about anything. If it's more on the coaching front of things, I want to make sure we take time to make sure everybody's square on the coaching front of things. So if it's more admin or roster changes, we can talk about that too.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So I've got the fancy schmancy screen to share with you guys tonight. I can figure out how to do this and make it a multi.
Can we ask you a question while you're doing that?
Yeah, fire away, shoot.
How excited are you for Ultraman?
Very excited. Honestly,
I'm so fascinated and want to know all the behind the scenes coaching stuff behind this too.
Yeah, I'm stoked about it. Ultraman is a really cool event to go and be a part of. It just is really rad. So we have two of our athletes that are there. Day one is a 6.2 mile swim, 91 mile bike. Day two is a 175 mile bike, and day three is a 52.4 mile run. So it's incredible to watch. It's a very nice, tight-knit community of athletes, and everybody's just trying to make sure they get through every day at the 12-hour cutoff. So yeah, I'm excited. It's a little warm down there, but we'll see what everybody's got under the hood.
I saw there was a type 1 guy there, Cliff.
I know it. Yeah, he's one of the only very few that is type 1 that has ever completed the distance. As well, there was a guy last week who I know also from the LA area who just did the 7 marathons challenge and completed it as a type 1. So that was a huge deal. Really amazing stuff for obviously me being a type 1. It's to sit on the sidelines and watch it. It's like, wow. Nowadays, it's impressive what you can do. It's more about how well you manage it, honestly. So it's nutrition and a lot of the other things that we talk about in coaching that could prevent somebody from not doing well. But yeah, it's exciting. Super exciting stuff.
When do you head down, Cliff?
Saturday night. So I'm going to fly down Saturday night, run about 13 miles with Julian and Ed Lomica, and spend some time with both those guys, and then watch them finish, pull them in, and then I'll be back on Monday.
Quick trip?
Yeah, quick trip. It's going to be warm down there. It's going to be hot. Yeah, but looking forward to it.
Nobody's feeling sorry for you about that today. It's like 40. It's been 40 in San Francisco for a week, and we're just not built for it,
Yeah.
So I know that's nothing compared to the East Coast folks, but it's way colder than it usually is here. So
yeah, no, it definitely is. All right, so
I listened to Melissa Yuri and Danny, I can't remember her last name, on the Rich Roll podcast talking about Ultraman and Epic 5, and I heard a term that I hadn't heard before, and I thought, oh my God, because they were talking about how their coaches had just said that they were diesels, like they could get a certain amount faster, but then at some point they weren't going to get faster, but boy, could they go forever.
Yeah.
And that they were diesels. And I was like, I can relate to this. So.
Yeah, if you keep going long and long, you can really become more durable and go long for sure. Getting fast is much more of an art to get there. So, yeah. Speaking of going long and the art of fueling, which Megan is fueling, we're going to be talking about nutrition for you guys tonight and for your athletes, which I think is you primed the pump until the last week, and I thought, why not dive into it now? I think it's a good one for us to be doing relatively early on for you guys. So so you guys can hopefully see my screen, and I've turned you guys off visually. So Raceday nutrition, I tried to come up with, some guidelines that will help you guys to create a plan for your athletes when you do a consult with them. as well as at least give yourselves reference points to know the numbers behind how much people should be expecting. And so, tonight we're going to talk about, target amounts, calories, water, salt, magnesium. We're going to talk about what it looks like for a short course athlete, for a middle distance athlete, for a long course athlete, and we're going to talk about water and electrolytes, and then lastly, troubleshooting when things go wrong. And probably that's where we'll spend a little more time, asking questions and back and forth on that one, because I think it's good to know what goes wrong, because this is like watching a scientific experiment with your athletes constantly, where you're trying to figure out what went right, what went wrong, and then how to always improve on it. And so all of your athletes will have some amount of history to work with, and that's what we want to plug into, is making sure that we don't, reinvent the wheel, so to speak, over and over again. Okay. So first things first, race nutrition overview. The goal should be to customize the nutrition to the athlete, okay? We know that everybody's going to process calories different. Your size is going to make a difference in terms of how many calories you can actually pull in. And so the nutrition plan has to be based on the goals of the individual, the intensity that person is putting out, even subject to heart rate. So we'll talk through all the different reasons on why and how things happen and play like that. Race nutrition really has to be rehearsed. This is something that we want to see many, many times over, so that we know exactly what to expect on race day. Our bodies are trainable. Just like in our own training, our nutrition is going to be something we're going to rehearse. And typically we do it in race scenarios, or we do it in our longer efforts to see that play out. So let's see. First things first, get your quantities right. It's not just a shove all we can in there, and it's certainly not let's see how few calories we can get by. You'll hear both extremes. It's the right amount. So it's the amount that your body will accept and tolerate and give you the proper energy, assuming you're properly pacing. So really important to know that. As Tilla, you alluded to last week, it is the fourth discipline. So if you're a triathlete, it is the fourth discipline, and I would say it's your second, kind of sport that you have to worry about if you're just doing any standalone. So anybody who's going longer, really, it's a two-sport process. Nutrition is so big, and to not even talk about it with your athletes is to just leave them in the dark. So it's really important for you guys to be versed in it. It is one of the reasons, but one of the top reasons, why races tend to go very bad. And even I would say somewhat the lead up into races is something that can go bad. And we'll touch on that, not in this call, on other future nutrition topics, but at least know that, this is not something that will ever go away. Your athletes will always have to be watching their nutrition on race day, and they'll have to get it right. It's lovely when people, have really executed this and they feel good, and they're, they can almost stop thinking about it a little bit because they've got their system down. That's where you want to get your athletes to be. So when the nutrition works, the body should be able to perform without your athletes celebrating frankly something less than they're capable of. So if you don't actually have them get their nutrition right, the problem is they're not going to execute anything that they did in training. And that's a real bummer, because they did super hard work, intervals, and they've been consistent for months and months, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, why didn't I do well? And you're scratching your head saying, I think it's because you didn't do this or that on pacing, or maybe we need to give you more running, or a lot of different factors. But first check the box and say, hey, did we get the nutrition right? So your goal should be to have the stomach empty. It should fill up and empty, fill up and empty, fill up and empty, and it just kind of doesn't, you don't want it to back up. I use in parentheses tequila. It's kind of like, you don't want to be throwing everything in there, and then it's like that last something you took in because it just seemed like it was good, and you just kind of borrowed it from the course, and the next thing you're bringing everything back up that you're trying to keep down and use. So keep it simple. Keep the stomach emptying on a regular basis as a general principle. So you're going to want to develop a plan and a protocol with your athletes. Some may already have protocols that they already use. That's great. You can kind of give your thoughts and 2 cents on it, but it really should be measured out as best you possibly can. And so this can be a conversation or it can be a one-on-one consult with your athletes. Typically, if I'm going to spend a lot of time, and really develop a plan with athletes, generally speaking, that's a one-to-one kind of thing where, you may bill them separately for that, and that's up to you guys how you want to do that. I give a lot of nutritional advice, but when it comes to specific plans for nutrition, it takes some time to prepare them. So just be aware that, you're going to spend some time to put it together. Fine-tune things from other races and training. They've got tons of notes. Your athletes have notes that they've prepared that can give you clues as to what's happening. And so we don't want to, lose that history and forget, what your athletes have to use. So just remember you have that available. Okay, let's jump into it. Short course. So I'm defining this as 90 minutes or less that your athletes are racing. And, there's really not a whole lot you can get in here, right? You're redlining it. You're going super hard and deep, and, there's not a whole lot the body wants to actually take in. And I'd say calorie-wise, only about 50% of what you would take in, of a longer distance race is actually something that you can get in. And it's even debatable whether or not you might need that. If you do your prep and your job going up to the front of that race, you really should just go, have some water, maybe you need some electrolytes and things like that. But, you don't need to be throwing down lots of calories on a short distance race that your body is providing the energy. So most races start early in the day, less overall nutritional need. The body temperatures are cooler. We're done much earlier in the day. So there's more GI distress if you try to put stuff in there. Imagine sloshing stuff around really hard and high intense. It's not going to go very well if you try and introduce stuff in there. I always laugh when I see the beer mile and I see these guys, slugging back beers as they're going flying, around a track. And it's just insane the fact that these guys, can put down that kind of alcohol. And, anyway, the stomach really does not want to be ingesting and digesting things at this distance. It's just very difficult. So your body has ample fuel. Your athletes are utilizing fats and glycogen. Glycogen being what's stored in the muscles, and fat as actual visceral fat and external fat that they're using to burn to get themselves through the race. Hydration is important. As I mentioned, weather can kind of dictate there a little bit. If you have larger athletes, they're probably going to need some fluids to not cramp at the end of, for instance, a sprint triathlon or a 10K race. Water is going to be needed. But we're not talking, again, about needing calories of any sorts unless they're pushing past that 90-minute barrier. So electrolytes, they're, again, less important. They're not important, they're less important. The conditions in the day dictate. So if you have an athlete that's doing a very humid, hot race, for instance, in Florida, and they're coming from, New York, where it's very dry and cool, perhaps they need more, and you need to kind of address that. I can remember doing the Bone Island 70.3, and it was very humid, very hot, and it was in the middle of the winter. And, I found that my sweat rate was much, much higher, and I needed a lot more resources just to stay hydrated at that point. So just keep that in mind for you guys.
Hey, so Cliff, do you recommend getting a sweat rate test, like doing one, a test?
It's not really necessary. It's something, it's very interesting. You'll always learn something about your athletes when you do those types of tests. But typically, a sweat rate test, your body is conditioned to different things. So if you're very acclimated in the middle of the summertime and you have an athlete do a sweat test, it's going to show them performing fairly nicely. If you do that same test in the middle of the winter when they're acclimated to dry and cool conditions, they're not going to be very successful. So that test result may reveal that they need a lot more electrolytes and fluids at certain outputs than they would in the summertime. So what I would say is just, it's always interesting to do testing, but do you really need to? I'm going to say no. I went to the Gatorade Institute and did their half Ironman protocol fascinating. I learned tons of stuff there. The scientists, they stand there with the clipboard. He ate a gel. He ate, he ingested a salt pill. And they weigh you before and after, and they have all the metabolic cart equipment hooked up to you, and you're measuring VO2 max and exchange ratios. Fascinating. But at the end of the day, you look at the report and it says you should drink the same amount of water that I'm going to show you in these charts. And it's based on your weight, and it's based on the duration that you're out there. So, yeah, good for overall education, though. And if you're,
I was just kind of curious if there was really a lot of value to it. I know there's information there, but
yeah, and there certainly would be value if you had an athlete that, for instance, was like maybe trying to qualify at a special race that had special conditions, or maybe somebody that you're thinking someday you're down the road and you're working with a very advanced athlete who might want to be an Olympian or is trying to qualify for some sort of big event. Maybe that makes sense. Yeah.
Hey, Cliff, a quick question. Yeah. It may be totally individual, but I certainly myself, I noticed that I sweat very little at the beginning of the season. As I get into it, my sweat rate goes higher and higher and higher, and then it stabilizes probably around the April-May time frame. Mm-hmm. Is that normal, or is it just me?
Well, it does tend to, if you're coming out of the winter where everything's dry, you may not even realize how much you're actually sweating at that point. If you're in a room, right, how do I say this? It's almost like you're living in an arid environment. And then suddenly when it gets warmer outside, you may feel like you're sweating more. It's really just because you can't sweat as readily, maybe because it's humid or you're training outside. But your body acclimates over about a month. 3 to 5 weeks, is about typical. So if you were to, try to acclimate for like a race, our protocol is usually about 3 to 6 weeks long. Don't need more than that. If you went and tried to go and, prepare for, I'm doing, Arizona, I better start sitting in the sauna. Well, kind of, you're just clocking time in the sauna, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Good question. All right, back to short course. So hydration, we covered that. Electrolytes less important, covered that. Fluids and calories are better for these distances. Yeah, I mean, that's common sense, right? You're not going to try and take down something that's solid because it's just not going to digest. And the value that you're looking for there in terms of where does blood stop being, when does the stomach stop using blood more quickly is above 150 beats per minute. It keeps dropping off. So the blood gets shunted to the extremities, the arms and the working muscles, and then we find that that's when the stomach really starts to shut down, and anything that's in there is really emptying at a much slower rate. So solids are especially going to just sit in there. Fluids get what's called first pass metabolism, which means that when you drink something, it's actually going through your lips, your gums, your tongue, and sublingually it's being pulled in, which is an awesome thing. So if your athletes need calories quickly and more desperately, you can recommend to them that they kind of swish around some sort of sugary food in their mouth as kind of a rescue.
So wait, repeat the 150 beats per minute. That's a static number for everybody?
Don't think of it as an absolutely hard-coded number. Think of it kind of like it's a continuum. But yes, 150 beats per minute and more for most athletes, or a perceived effort, let's just call it a 5 or more, and you're going to see, digestion really start to slow down. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, a chart. Shocker. A chart.
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe. Coach Cliff and his charts.
This is a sexy chart.
It's got a lot of color to it. It's got a lot of color. So,
I think I like this almost as much as the CTL chart.
Yeah, I do like the CTL chart a lot too. All right, so this fancy chart. You got your goal time in hours, and this is something that you can reference with your athletes. We also share it with our athletes, is our nutrition and fueling based on their time and their goal in terms of the number of hours and based on their weight. So, these are our recommended max values for whether it's calories, sodium, um, fluids, and potassium. And you're going to find that some athletes can do more or less than some of these things. Ironman is where you start to see a little some funkiness, some outliers for some people. But for the most part, they're pretty darn good. And as long as you're keeping them with a grain of sand, that you're trying out all this stuff anyway with your athletes, then you should be in a good spot. So this first column, really that's your short course folks, right? No calories needed. If you're 200 pounds, you might need to get a little bit of calories in somewhere along the way there from a sports drink. If you're doing a 1 hour or more race, your sodium is going to be 250 milligrams. If you're on the lighter side, up to 400. If you are on the heavier side, and that's not very much, really. It's not much at all. So you could go more on some of those for sodium. And then for short course, less than 140 pounds, you're looking at about 21 ounces, 20 ounces per hour. And if you're 200 pounds or more, you can really get away with 27, really 30 or more. But again, for short races, you don't need all that much. Less than, you're going to get around probably less than 40 milligrams per hour of potassium if you're less than 140 pounds. And if you're 200 plus pounds, you're really at that 55 plus kind of mark. So now if we moved into the middle distance, things start to change a lot more. Nutrition becomes a lot more interesting. You can fake it pretty darn good in a short course venue. In an Olympic distance, you still can fake it a bit. You still can, but you're not going to get away with everything. And so an Olympic distance try, we're talking about half marathons. We're talking about up to a marathon, actually, for some of our faster athletes. And some slower athletes may fall into ultra longer stuff, depending upon their marathon finishing time. So total caloric intake may be capped by heart rate and intensity, and the stomach shuts down, as I mentioned, Suzanne, at greater than 150 beats per minute. That's just a swing point for you to think about. That can be really also defined, as I said, as a perceived effort of a 5 or more. It could be defined by a lot of different zones and targets we use, but that's a pretty good number to use. So more calories can be ingested for the middle distance safely. Now we're up to about 80% of what our athletes can actually consume up to what they're physically capable of, their maximum, if we were to say 100%. So we're at about 80% of max. And our GI distress and the Buddha belly, what is that? Well, that's if you think about the stomach. The stomach has this limited amount of surface area. And we're going to throw all this stuff in there. And when you throw a lot of stuff in there, some things get absorbed quickly, some things don't. And some things play nicely, and some things don't. So if you introduce lots of protein and fat, GI is going to slow down. When we throw in things like Gatorade, that's absorbed by a very different type of enzyme. Now, if you throw in that enzyme plus the substrates to break it down, suddenly things start piling up rapidly because you've got different things to break down relatively the same stuff. And there's only so much stomach surface area. And in that case, what happens next? Everything comes back up or comes back out, and it's not pretty. So, like I said in the beginning, the goal is to really have the stomach kind of empty itself out and be clear. And the more simple and the more even you're giving that stomach the food, the better it's going to happen for your athletes. So yeah, Gatorade is kind of a bit of a tough beast because it's on a lot of courses, and our athletes like it because it's sweet, it's salty, it's carbs, it's water. It's got just about everything, including rotting your teeth, but it is really good stuff for endurance. It frankly is. But if you're going to have your athletes use it and they're going to use it, they should go with it. And then if they're going to not go with it, then they should really stick to their other nutrition. If they have to switch over to Gatorade, what you want to do is have them kind of space it out with some water in about 30 to 45 minutes in between, which is not a great scenario to try and tell people when they're doing an ultra long event that they can't eat. So on the bike, you can get away with a little bit more in triathlon. You can't really get away with that kind of stuff in running.
Right. So in your chart, when you have the calorie per hour,
Mm-hmm.
is Is that an average of the biking and running? Because is it the same for both?
No, no. So there's a whole separate chart, and I'll share that with you guys too. I tried to give you the maximum on the bike mostly. So for the run, it may be actually less. These are just the maximums for the athletes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good question. Okay, so in the middle distance, some solids on the bike if you're doing triathlon, if you're less than heart rate zone 4. Some of our, upper range, more elite, faster athletes are type C athletes. They're going to be able to actually redline it at just low zone 4 for a lot of this. So that's pretty hard, but they're going to really need to be doing more liquids and more gels and things like that nature. But everybody else can get in quite a good number of solids on the bike. And early on, when you're a little bit hungrier and you can take in solids, I recommend it that way. And then as you go through the race, you kind of titrate down to gels or gummies or things like that. Protein and fat, not really recommended. There's mixed studies on a lot of different things on this nature and topic. All I will tell you is that it takes quite a bit to break down fat and protein. And we're talking still about a race that's pretty fast and pretty hard. The 70.3 distance and the Olympic distance, they're pretty close in terms of the output for a lot of athletes. Now, if you introduce these things, they tend to slow the body down in terms of absorbing calories. So we don't want to try and do that unless our athletes are out there for a long, extended period of time and they're just trying to get something to satiate. That's actually okay, a little bit, but we're really not talking about a whole lot. There was a lot of talk about protein going into athletes while they're racing. I think personally, and in my experience, I see a lot of athletes do well with protein afterwards, carbs afterwards. But protein during, the only thing it could maybe do for your athletes is keep them satiated, which is not a terrible thing, but in a very small recommended dose. And a lot of people will report having a little bit of GI distress, gurgling, burping because of protein, which is not very comfortable when you're trying to do a race like a half or even a marathon for that matter. So back to the up to now 4 hours kind of time frame, 4 and 5 hours-ish, you can see that the calories have gone up quite a bit. They're up to about 80% of max. I think it's probably more apparent to see that the sodium demands have gone way up for a lot more of these distances. That's kind of an impressive number to see. That in the beginning, a lot of athletes can kind of get away with lower sodium for shorter distances, but when we get up to some of these faster, longer races, we're going to need some more sodium to come to the mix. Your athletes are going to struggle to get in fluids, and you're going to need them to immediately after the race. I highly recommend they jot down in their notes, hey, this is how much I had. I drank this bottle and this bottle, and it's only going to be fresh in their mind for like the first 48 hours. So try to get them to report to you a little bit of information there, because that will help you diagnose how the race played out. If you're watching their heart rate go up and it's a warm race, but you know what, they didn't hydrate well enough, you could make some assumptions and say, maybe my athlete isn't as aerobically fit as I thought. But in reality, it's just like the car and the engine was just overheating. So it's you kind of have to play a little bit of detective on this, but information is important for you guys to be kind of observing nutritionally, as it does impact your race quite a bit.
Is there an upper level for, specifically liquid?
Yeah. It's completely individualized. I've seen some pretty wacky numbers, some pretty big numbers, up to even 3/4 of an ounce per minute and an ounce per minute. For some people, you have to really keep the salt coming in. If the salt is not present, it's just going to sit there in the stomach and just pile up. And there you hear stories, very rarely, of hyponatremia, which is basically too much fluid. And usually that happens because there's not enough electrolytes. Somebody didn't take their electrolytes, and therefore the water is kind of just pooling in the body. You have to really force down a lot of fluids to get to that point. Most people are more severely dehydrated or on the edge. And you're fighting a losing battle, really. We know that you're losing it quickly.
Well, because once you get dehydrated, it's hard to come back, right?
Very hard to come back. Yep. In fact, I'd even venture to say it's not really survivable to come back from in terms of a performance standpoint. You're going to lose, if you lose 10% of your body weight or 2 to 3 pounds of body weight, you're easily going to slide 25% slower. You're going to see your performance just completely knifed down. On the longer stuff, shorter stuff, you can kind of get away with it. Yeah. Good question, Suzanne.
Always thinking about food. Whether it's liquid, gels, peanut butter and jelly, rice cakes, pizza, whatever.
It is.
You can. I feel like you can have too much salt, though. I know that is probably not a popular opinion with some TriStar athletes, but you can have too much salt.
I can't imagine who you're referencing.
Even the salty beast has his limitations, Mr. Ultraman. Yes, I think that it is also
Not
more
everybody
rare.
needs to have 2 of those pills every hour and a bottle.
Yeah. Well, some athletes, like I said, are outliers, but the reality is it is hard to overdo it with salt. And the consequences of overdoing it with salt are that you generally pass it, but it's just like anything. Too much of anything, and you're going to shut down the stomach. Once the stomach shuts down, nothing's going in, and it's not a good party. So we try to keep to the amounts that we know we need, and we play to the athlete's course, right? If it's a hot race, yes, titrate up to the max dose that body weight can handle for salt, or chromium, magnesium, all those good electrolytes that go in. Yeah, it's amazing. Just go to your first ever Ironman, and you're standing like at the 10K mark on the run, and you'll see all the list of all the things that I'm going to cover here at the end happening, and it's like fireworks watching terrible GI distress for sure. All right. Moving on to the long course, the big stuff, the harder big stuff. So half Ironman to Ironman racing events. I still lumped in half Ironman because some folks will be out there longer. And ultra distance bikes, some ultra run events, some centuries, big centuries, adventure races can fall into that. So a larger portion of fat is utilized in these longer distance races. And however, it's dependent upon how fit these athletes are and how capable they are of burning fat at higher rates. So our newer, athletes are going to bonk more than, our very fit athletes, and I'll explain that in the sense that when you train and you train in the right heart rate zones and your body becomes this efficient fat burning machine, and we do that through zone 2 and zone 3 heart rate, this aerobic heart rate zone. The body is going to preferentially burn fat, and it's going to do it at progressively higher heart rates and at lower outputs as well. And so that's exciting because that means that the glycogen that your body is carrying in your muscles doesn't have to be used, or it can be preserved to go longer. And since we know that there's only so much that you can actually take in GI-wise, carbs-wise, then we know that the goal, and that's what we do with all of our training, and that's why you do more training, for longer distance races, is to create economy, very, very high level of physiological economy. So I find it fascinating when you'll hear other coaches or other programs and nutritionists talk about, I got this athlete to do their whole Ironman on only 1,200 calories. And I say, yeah, that's great. Imagine if you actually gave them what they should have had, at least a normal amount. They would have had a breakthrough race. They could have gone much faster. So if you force your athletes to be that fat adapted, which is really cool and very, very great, I think it's a neat thing. They can't go as hard always, but we do know that pros and a lot of the top age groupers are going to get into this ultra fat burning state where they're burning fat right up to their threshold or just below it, which is very, very cool. And their chances of bonking are a lot less. Your beginner athlete, if they just ride out a high heart rate, they're going to blow up. And that's what we call, a bonk, essentially. All right. So I've got a couple repeat things in here, but I will say that calorie-wise, you can actually be at 100 to 110% on the longer races in terms of what your body can accept. I put in this caveat that you can actually take in more because when you're at this low intensity, sometimes you don't get the opportunity to eat on command. I'm going to eat every 15 minutes, space it out perfectly throughout the whole day. So in some cases, your body can store a little bit in that stomach without shutting it down completely, but it has to be trained. So it's not like you're going to go, in training, I ate nothing on most of my rides, and then suddenly race day, you're going to throw in 110%. It's just not going to happen without some sort of discomfort or problem. We still have things like GI distress, Buddha belly, when we're talking about Gatorade, or when we throw a lot of things in the tank. So we have a higher risk of heat and temperature affecting our performance, but also our nutritional performance here. So we're talking about the stomach shutting down because of high heat and core temperature. When the core temperature heats up, heart rate goes up and absorption goes down. So bad things happen, and that's why we really have to get our athletes to be thinking about how to stay cool out on the course ongoing. And fluids help process those calories too. Really critical to know that. Is that without water, you're not actually going to process those calories and break them down appropriately. Questions on any of that so far?
What I find fascinating every time I watch Kona on TV is the pace with which the pros and the age group leads go. And I have no idea, of course, what their heart rates are, but looking at that output, how on earth they can fuel that efficiently for that long at that output, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible, and they're burning fat, and fat grams don't need to be replaced at that high output. And fat has 9 calories per gram, carbs only have 4. And so when you convert that, what happens is, your glycogen, your body only holds about, smaller people, it's 1,300. Your larger athletes are going to be about 1,800 to 2,100 maybe. And that could go pretty quick. You know how quick? 90 minutes. That's what we saw on the first slide deck here about, why can we go through and not eat anything for those short, easy races.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I'm always impressed too when I see that high output, and I think, boy, it just seems like they're redlining, and they should be. Something's not normal about that, and it's not. It's frankly not, because they've really put themselves into this very perfect space to be able to do it. It's a beautiful thing to watch. All right. So I talked about the high increased risk of core temperature affecting nutrition. It's critical to front load calories in some of these longer races, so that's where that 110% comes in, because we know that in the beginning of the bike, for instance, of a long distance in triathlon, that your core temperature is lower. You have opportunities to pedal coast where you'll digest a little bit more, and when you get to the end of the bike, it gets harder taking calories. As the day progresses, it starts to get lower and lower and lower. You may find that your athletes, for instance, in Ironman, they drop down to about 80% of what they're fully capable, which is fairly similar to what they're going to get in on the run. It's more like 80% or even 75% of their max. So let's see. Solids on the bike, yes, they're still encouraged. And this is an important and a biggie, especially for athletes, in endurance events that are doing, Ironman, is to feel the urge to pee and go in the first 56 miles. A lot of you guys have heard me talk about that, that you need to do that, because that's the only way we know for sure that you're hydrated. And if you're not able to go in the first 56 miles, then I would say in a 70.3, at least the first 40, then you're behind, and you need to play catch up, and you need to really get moving on it, and you also need to investigate your electrolytes, because the electrolytes force your thirst mechanism. That's why we take them. And it's probably a good juncture here for me to also tell you guys why. And we've had independently with each one of you guys conversations about base salts. I love base salts, but they have their place. I'd like to have base salts with salt stick, because salt stick is a more comprehensive electrolyte profile. It's got all the things that you're sweating out. And when you ingest them and swallow them, it breaks up and it releases a big mega dose in your stomach. But base salts are nice because right when you put it in your mouth, it's going to force you to drink. It's going to make you thirsty. You're going to get that pasty kind of mouth feeling. And so that's not a bad thing to have for your athletes. So you may want to encourage them to use both. They may want to just use both. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely. Just don't let them become reliant.
That's huge. I switched from salt sticks over to base salt. So for me, it was an either or, and my tummy and body has been infinitely happier. I think you made a point, Cliff, earlier about the first tier of absorption, which is the gums and the tongue and the just in the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
At least for me, that I mean, the moment I put it in, it doesn't have to go down to my tummy, although I do swallow it, of course, with water and other things. But and you made that point as well, that it's so individualized. So it took me years to find that, but it's interesting. I may experiment with both. I've never tried both. It's been either or for me.
Yeah, I think it's great that you experiment and that you tweak it and that you find what works for you. Because let me tell you, you got plenty of opportunity for your athletes, yourself, to experiment, and you kind of want to have backup, right? Because if you are in a race and it's only chocolate, espresso, love, goo that I can eat, boy, I mean, that's pretty limiting if you think about, you try to take things that are on the course. And but anyway, yeah, good point.
Cliff, I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
Any disadvantage to just opening up those salt tabs and emptying them into your drink so you're not trying to swallow pills while you're on the bike?
No disadvantage that I know of. The only thing is maybe like if you left it in a suspension for a long time, I don't know what that would do. Like if you left it overnight, normally it's something you mix kind of day of.
Right.
And some people will say, hey, that's just a lot of salt that doesn't get mixed in. It may be too salty for them, the taste. That's why it's usually in a pill form, is because it's so salty. But
right.
it really is to the individual. That I recommended and advocated that for a lot of years, and I still like that a lot, that approach, as long as it's palatable.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a point where you don't want to taste salt anymore. Like, it's like, I can't, like, yeah. After like 15 hours.
That's so funny. I can't.
None of you will ever know that long, but because you're all fast.
The other question I have is,
yeah.
I mean, on the bike is a bigger issue than the run, but I know that for the vast majority of athletes, they're peeing on the bike when they find a hill, which obviously you got to be really careful, like who's around you.
Yeah.
But
why the hill? Tell me about the hill.
You can get in trouble for doing that, I guess, is my concern. So, like, are we encouraging our athletes, or is it just kind of like a do what you feel is right kind of thing?
I think everybody's got their own personal boundary on that one.
Okay.
You're gonna have to.
Wait. What's the hill thing?
Going downhill.
I just pee.
You just do it downhill when you can actually relax. Yeah. I tried doing it on the run, and it messed me up pretty good.
Sometimes if you don't have any hills, you just go. But I know what you mean. You have to kind of raise yourself up a little bit.
Yeah, the ability to relax. Yeah, I will tell you that in my race career,
I always look to see if there's anybody close behind me, but also that's why you don't draft, right? Right.
That's how you get clearly somebody off your wheel.
Yeah, that's how you get a salty water bottle.
Yes.
Uh, I was only able to pee once in an Ironman marathon while running, and it was my fastest marathon.
Really?
Yeah,
I
happened.
had my best time too, but I did some damage there. I don't know.
Really? Yeah.
I think
I don't know. Well, I wasn't. I was doing an Ironman. Maybe you were doing a half. It's a little different. I think you can go slower and relax a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah.
Just you guys, hold on. Older woman had 3 kids. You don't really have to think about it that much.
Nope. Frankly, and at some point, you can just pee anywhere.
If we're throwing it all out there, that's all I'm saying.
Cliff is always like, "Did you pee?" I'm like, "When did I not?"
This is good. This is good. I feel the gelling.
Can we go back to the serious? Can we go back to the serious question?
Yes.
So all this information that you have there,
Yeah.
have you noticed any differences to women versus men? What seems to work better?
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
In regards to amounts, or are we talking about?
Yes, I am specifically talking about calorie intake, all that stuff.
As I said, it's highly individualized. The chart really is broken down by weight and by time.
Right.
I think that in general, most of my female athletes tend to be more aerobic. They tend to need a little bit less calories. This is just on average. And the total amounts of calories that they need are a little bit less. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but men tend to have a little bit more muscle and a little more mass that they're trying to feed their muscles. And this actually comes down a little bit of psychology, but during training, a lot of male athletes have a hard time going slow, and they have a hard time getting to that aerobic point where they're so successfully aerobic that they're burning more fat. And so therefore, those athletes are what we call the sugar burners. The sugar burners means they're going to need more carb calories, and they're just not as fuel efficient. And so I would say, on the whole, if you just took pound for pound, male versus female, I find my female athletes tend to be more compliant in terms of their training regimen sometimes, so to speak. But that it's still relatively a generality, what I'm saying here. And so that's why we do throw out the caveat of, everybody's the special snowflake. That you gotta think about each person a little differently.
So what would you say to somebody who came in and said, "Hey, so tell me what I'm supposed to eat for, what should I be eating on my first long ride?"
Well,
what's your recommendation? Or would you give them more the calorie and you figure out how to get it in?
I think the conversation starts kind of like this. It's almost like saying, "What should I eat for breakfast tomorrow?" I mean, it's so general, right? That to me, there's a lot of motivations behind what you're doing, what you're eating, when, and why. And you're going to start getting into, nutrition philosophies and fueling philosophies. So on future calls, we're going to talk a lot more about that stuff, like different types of diets and things like that, and even preparing for certain days and what you want to accomplish and why. It's such a sophisticated topic that on the coaching side, if you're going to coach somebody for nutrition, it's a whole different thing. It's like literally, we're going to spend a whole nother topic on just that alone. But yeah, the answer is it's very complex. For some of my athletes in the past, I remember I created like a whole spreadsheet that was kind of like, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. And this one woman I created for, she loved it. And then it's just not very practical though, but it is a good learning thing to go through. But I think it's just go through enough scenarios and situations, and then just remember who your audience is. Are you talking about a beginner athlete, an intermediate, and an advanced? And remember that there's an assumption of how fit those individuals are as they start. So beginners, they have some sort of, they're more sugar burners. Then we get into the kind of the mixed bag group, your B levels, where some are very fuel efficient, some aren't, or during their off season they're not, but during season they are. And then when you finally get to your elite folks, they tend to be very aerobic. They can fuel themselves with fat and protein more readily. It's a deep subject. Deep subject. That's why I'm really trying to just stay on the surface with the racing for right now. Good?
Okie dokie.
All right.
All good.
I still didn't answer your question about how much to eat or what to eat for a long ride, but we'll get to it.
That's okay.
Okay. All right. So last bits here, we talked about, I think, all these targets, and I think we even jumped into our slower athletes and their heart rate. We talked about that and absorption. So one last kind of note on the long course, and that is that your athletes can actually, your slower athletes, your beginners and newbie athletes can take in, a little bit more fat and a little bit more protein than previous. So maybe it's even up to 20% of their day's calories can come in the form of something, with a little more fat or protein in it, and that's perfectly acceptable because the lower your heart rate is and the longer your day is, the more your stomach can absorb calories. Because if your heart rate's lower, it's going to be able to absorb those things.
Are these the people that are eating the sandwich?
Yes. Yeah.
There are people eating giant sandwiches.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what's in that sandwich, but depends what's in that sandwich. But yes. All right, so your long course triathlons, for the most part, you've got a pretty good swath range of calories. I really think, though, that 375 is about the max. You will see some pros go up to 500 and 600. I don't know how much of that they're actually absorbing or when that actually gets absorbed. It may just sit in there for a long time on the bike until they get off, and then, maybe a lot of it gets in. Or maybe they're fueling it intermittent time periods. But generally speaking, for the size of 200 pounds, like 375, is probably about max, because otherwise it's just gonna pile up in there a little bit. As long as it's the same stuff, it's gonna go out pretty good. But if you throw other stuff in there and it can have a backup, and that's not good. All right, so the last bit we're gonna spend some time on is quarterbacking when things go wrong. Cramping. Okay, cramping can happen for quite a few reasons, but I'm going to touch on the big ones. It can happen due to lack of electrolytes, even when you're drinking enough water, but you don't have enough salt, for instance, and that's probably the most common. It can be due to a lack of specificity and too much intensity in the race, so your pacing is way off for what the training would actually support. That means your muscles will cramp. If they're not used to climbing a big hill and they've been riding flat, your athletes, for a long period of time, good chance that the muscle's going to respond by cramping up. You get that Buddha belly, which I talked about before, and that's just an introduction of multiple types of carbohydrates into the stomach, doubling the enzymes, doubling the substrates. Vomiting, belching, gas. These are very common because of too much food taken in all at once, for instance. So bad spacing between your intervals of food and or water. Your stomach not emptying due to a lack of salt and or water, because that's what helps us process things. That water is actually allowing the body to pull in the nutrients. Higher than goal race pace effort. That's also going to tend to shut things down because higher heart rate, slower absorption of food. And that's why it's not just because coaches say, oh, you should go slow and take care of yourself and watch the heart rate. It's because all these things start to come into play. You go off the reservation, you do your own thing, your nutrition shuts down, and then the day ends. So it's really interesting how a lot of the pacing stuff that we have for our athletes, we can tell them why they did something right or wrong very clearly, and then you've got all their data to back it up. Stomach cramping. This is actually due to dehydration oftentimes, and this can be caused by consuming foods that were not prepared during their training as well for race day, so they didn't really train by drinking Coke or Gatorade, and then suddenly they took it on race day and their stomach just said no thank you, that didn't work for me. But dehydration is actually a symptom when you get stomach cramping. Salt-covered clothes and skin. This can be due to dehydration and or higher than normal sweat rate, and this can be due to hotter conditions. It may also be a sign of poor acclimation. Extra electrolytes may be needed for these athletes, such as sodium chloride, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. All right. Other considerations that I jotted in here for you guys: food allergy restrictions. If your athletes have food allergies, something to be mindful of. Just asking them about. In Ironman, special needs. Do you carry food? The aid stations are plenty. Just remember, they can grab stuff, from aid stations. They don't need to be carrying it, on their person, because that's a lot of work. Coach Megan.
To that point, I totally agree with that, and we all know that I carry way too much, and each Ironman is a little bit less. But what I learned at Cozumel is that different races have different nutrition on course.
Yeah.
And I overdid it on the bike, but I underdid it on the run, because, as you very wisely say, don't worry about the run. There's one every mile. You can just grab stuff and go. But in Mexico, what they had at the aid stations on the run was not what I was used to. And therefore, that's where the crunch, there was not a banana anywhere.
Yeah.
On that entire race course all day.
So
now I know that, but yeah. So I mean, I think if you're I don't want cookies. I want this. I want there wasn't a smorgasbord. There was no Coke. There was no banana. So
yeah, it's just good to know wherever the race is. Hopefully, you can always have the option to bring your own nutrition, but hopefully it's published what the race actually has, and you can go with that. But the reason I say really to go with the course nutrition is it's just easier. The race tends to go easier because you're not carrying all your stuff, for the most part. Yeah, but there are extenuating circumstances. All right, so caffeine as a performance enhancer, it is legal. It is legal, but you better be knowing how it's going to affect you and how much of it's going to affect you. But caffeine is definitely a performance enhancer that's legal. Not everybody needs it. It definitely keeps more focus for those athletes who are fading in the end of a race, and that's not a bad thing. The alertness and the ability to keep the drive going.
So do you advocate going caffeine-free prior to a race for a certain amount of time?
I don't typically.
You gotta mute yourself.
Mute, Megan. Thank you. I don't typically back off that much caffeine before a race. I may go a little bit lighter on my coffee, but I think I try to keep. This is just my own personal take. Try to be very consistent with what I'm doing right up to even race day. I may back off a little bit on the I like espresso roast. Instead, I'll switch over to just drip coffee, and so. Everybody's a little different with that. If you're not sleeping well, then you absolutely should be backing off the coffee. That's kind of the litmus test for me. But if you drink coffee at 5:30 in the morning every morning, you can be like clockwork. That's better for you. As far as the performance enhancement part, if you're going to try it, you need to try it in training. If you're going to do some sort of supplementation, caffeine and whatnot, that's probably better to test that out. All right, so
espresso roast, fancy pants.
the last couple here. How long can you go without food? Some can fake it with bad nutrition up to 5 hours. Most will fail at 4, and you never can fake it at the long stuff, the ultra stuff. So overnight events, that also is extremely challenging, and you can have a lot more types of regular food. Like the engineered food starts to become less important. We have kind of neat things like date bars that you can kind of take on, and really it's up to you and the athlete to decide. But as long as it's practiced and rehearsed, it's a good thing. So, like for instance, Ultraman, Julian's got his own nutrition, different stuff that he's going to take out for this weekend, and he's been using it in his training. But you don't have to rely just on the engineered products. Is basically what it comes down to. And I think that was my last slide. Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? Are you hungry?
No, it's just complicated, and everybody's got to figure it out on their own. Is really that's the fact.
Yeah, you have to experiment. You have to go through a lot of different scenarios and situations, and you definitely cannot ignore it. Your athletes can't ignore it either, and you'll need to prep them for this, especially your beginner athletes who won't have any concept of this. We'll have a whole separate conversation on what day-to-day life and nutrition looks like. But for now, race nutrition, rely on the tables there to look at them and rely on them there because they are helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So, in addition to this topic, we could have an entire class on the preceding 2-3 days to the race.
Yeah.
Because that was another penny that dropped for me over the years. Is race day nutrition is critical, absolutely, but my big aha was that how you get to race day and how you start eating differently 3-4 days out, and then what happens the day before, the night before, 2 days before. I think that's an interesting topic as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and that'll be a separate topic. It's going to be taper week is what we'll call it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good one. Okay, good heady subject. Thanks for being here, coaches. Leave me your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns. Have a great week of training, and Suzanne, we'll chat about your athletes too offline. And till next week, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great night, guys. I guess I'll see you. You'll see me maybe a little bit in Florida if you're on social media, but I'll see you guys.
I'll see you Saturday.
Oh, that's right. I'll see you Saturday. Very cool.
Very excited.
Very excited.
Wait, are you coming Saturday? Kyle, I'm going to try to make it.